She didn't know why she stopped, only that she couldn't walk past him. The wind had picked up, turning the November rain into icy needles that stung her cheeks as she pulled her coat tighter and stepped out of the train station after her. Double shift at the diner. Lena's feet ached, her socks were soaked through, and her stomach gnawed from hours without food. She had $10 in her coat pocket, just enough for a cup of soup and a cheap coffee to get her through the night. But as she hurried past the benches near the station's east exit, she caught a glimpse of a man sitting alone, hunched forward, rain dripping from the edge of his hood. Something made her look twice. He wasn't panhandling, he wasn't asking anyone for anything, he just sat there still, shivering and looking down at the pavement like he'd given up on being seen. And in a city where everyone was always rushing, where people averted their eyes and quickened their pace around discomfort, Lena slowed. Maybe it was the way he held his hands, pale, trembling, cupped in his lap like he was afraid to ask. Or maybe it was something in his posture, not just cold or hungry, but hollow. The kind of hollow she recognized because she carried it too. She took a hesitant step toward him. "Are you okay?" she asked, the words sounding smaller than she intended. He looked up slowly. His eyes were tired but clear, startlingly clear. And for a moment, she wondered if he'd always looked like this, quiet, haunted, out of place. "Do you have anything for a ticket home?" he asked softly. His voice wasn't desperate. It wasn't begging. It was just empty, the kind of voice that doesn't expect an answer. Lena hesitated. Her hand brushed the $10 bill in her pocket, her last $10. It wasn't symbolic. It wasn't poetic. It was all she had left until her next paycheck, and even then, that might not come. Rent was late. The electric company had already left a red notice on her door. She hadn't told anyone. What could she say? That she worked full-time and still couldn't afford to live? That every meal was a calculation, every bus ride a gamble? She could have walked away, could have said sorry and kept moving like everyone else. But instead, she reached into her coat, pulled out the $10 bill and held it out. The man stared at it like it was something sacred. Then slowly, cautiously, he reached for it. Their fingers brushed, and he looked into her eyes. "You're the first person who saw me today," he said. And then he smiled, not big, not dramatic, just enough to make her throat tighten. "Thank you." Before she could say anything else, he stood up, nodded once, and walked off into the rain. No name, no story, just a man with a hood and a heavy silence. Lena stood there for a while, her fingers still tingling from where they'd touched. She told herself it was nothing, just a small act of kindness, just $10, but it felt like something bigger had passed between them, like a thread had been tied, invisible but unbreakable. She didn't sleep well that night. Her stomach growled, and the draft from the cracked window by her bed made her shiver. But it wasn't the hunger or the cold that kept her awake. It was his words. "You're the first person who saw me today." She thought about all the times she'd felt invisible, sitting at the back of the class in high school with shoes she'd glued together herself, serving customers who never looked her in the eye, walking home in silence while couples and families passed her by like she didn't exist. She had become used to the world looking past her, so used to it that she barely noticed anymore. And yet, in that brief moment, she'd seen someone else, someone who needed to be seen. Maybe that's all kindness really was, the decision to stop when it's easier to keep walking. The next morning, the diner was slow. Rain still fell in sheets across the sidewalk, and only the usual regulars trickled in. Lena's manager barked about cleaning schedules and inventory sheets, but her mind kept drifting back to the stranger. She wondered where he'd gone, if he'd gotten a ticket, if he'd really needed one. What if it had been a scam? What if he just pocketed the cash and vanished into another alley, another lie? But even with those doubts, she didn't regret it. Something about the way he looked at her, it didn't feel like a lie. On her lunch break, she walked to the train station again. The bench was empty. She asked the clerk if anyone had bought a late ticket the night before. The woman behind the counter shrugged. "Cash sales? We get a few. Don't track them unless there's a reason." Lena nodded and walked away, feeling foolish. She told herself to forget it, just a moment, just a man, just $10. But a week later, something arrived in the mail, an envelope with no return address. Inside, a single slip of thick, cream-colored paper. On it, handwritten in neat, careful print, were the words, "Kindness never goes unseen. We'll meet again." That was all. No explanation, No signature beyond the letter, just a quiet promise that what she'd done had mattered. Lena read it 3 times before pressing it gently into the inside of her old notebook, tucking it between grocery lists and folded receipts. She didn't know what it meant. She didn't know who M was, but for the first time in a long time she felt seen. He was gone the next minute like he was never there, and yet something about the brief encounter stayed lodged in Lena's mind like a splinter under skin. A moment too quiet to forget, too real to explain. The next morning, despite the exhaustion in her legs and the heaviness in her chest from another night without sleep, she found herself walking back to the station before her shift, scanning every bench, every shadow, every passing face for a glimpse of the man in the rain-soaked navy coat. But he wasn't there, not leaning against the far pillars, not by the vending machines, not even near the garbage bins where others sometimes took shelter. She even asked the ticket clerk, a gray-haired woman with tired eyes, if anyone had bought an 8-night ticket with cash. The woman shrugged without interest. Plenty of people pay with cash. I don't remember a guy in a navy coat. Lena nodded, trying not to look as foolish as she felt. Maybe he had lied. Maybe he was just one of those drifters who mastered the art of guilt, knew exactly what to say to tug on the heart of someone too soft for her own good. The thought stung, but not as much as the deeper fear gnawing beneath it. What if she had been kind for nothing? She carried that unease with her all day, slinging plates of food to customers who never looked up from their phones, cleaning syrup off counters, dodging her manager's passive-aggressive jabs about the schedule. Her mind kept drifting back to that bench, to the way he'd said, "You're the first person who saw me today," and it echoed like a song she couldn't shake. By the time her shift ended, she had almost convinced herself to forget it, chalk it up to a moment of weakness, or maybe just a decent thing done in a cold world. But then, exactly 1 week after the night she handed away her last $10, she came home to find an envelope waiting on her doorstep. No return address, no postage, just her name, Lena, written in a bold, unfamiliar hand across the center. Her heart skipped as she looked around, scanning the hallway of her worn-down apartment building, but no one else was there. She tore it open with shaking fingers. Inside was a thick, cream-colored card folded once down the middle. No date, no signature, just one handwritten line in neat, careful script: "Kindness never goes unseen. We'll meet again." That was it. No explanation, no story, no money, no follow-up, no way to trace it. Just those 12 words and a single letter. Lena read it 3 times, her breath catching more each time. Her stomach flipped, not with fear, but with something harder to name, a mixture of confusion, hope, and disbelief that bordered on magic. She didn't know what to think. Part of her wanted to believe it was him, that somehow the man she helped had remembered, found her, and sent this as a way of saying thank you. But another part of her, the part that had been disappointed far too many times to trust easily, warned her not to read too much into it. People didn't come back. They didn't keep promises, not in her world. And yet the card was real. The handwriting was real. The feeling in her chest, like the first crack of sunlight after a week of clouds, was real. She placed the card carefully between the pages of her old notebook, right behind a folded grocery receipt and a photo of her mother she hadn't had the heart to throw away. For the next few days, she carried on as usual, though nothing felt usual anymore. Each time the doorbell rang downstairs, her pulse jumped. Every time a man walked into the diner with a coat remotely similar to the one he'd worn, she froze for just a second, wondering if it might be him. She didn't know why it mattered so much. Maybe because it was the first time in a long while someone had made her feel seen too. She tried asking the building manager if anyone had dropped something off for her. He shook his head. If they did, they didn't come through the front. She even checked the mailroom for any sign of another letter, but there was nothing else. Just bills, always bills. The letter gave her no answers, but it gave her something rarer, something she'd lost in the humdrum of day-to-day survival. A reason to believe something might still change. That maybe, just maybe, kindness did come back around. That maybe she hadn't given her last $10 to a con artist or a ghost or a man who'd disappear without a trace. Maybe she'd given them to someone who needed it just as badly as she did. But fate, as it often does, had a cruel way of testing hope. Because just as Lena was starting to hold on to the possibility that something good might return from her one selfless moment, the walls around her life began to crumble. Her landlord taped a second eviction notice to her door. The diner cut her hours again. Her electricity blinked out one night while she was reading, and when she called to ask about a payment plan, the customer service rep put her on hold and never came back. She pawned her coat, ate Saltines and dollar stork and soup for dinner. Her phone charger broke, and she couldn't afford to replace it, and in all that no more letters, no return of the $10. No sign of him, just silence. Empty, echoing silence. She should have known better, should have hardened herself like the rest of the world, should have kept the money, walked past him, saved herself, but she hadn't, because no matter how much life tried to drag her under, something inside Lena still believed in the power of small kindness, even if it cost her everything. Lena was evicted 3 days before Christmas, and there wasn't a single moment of drama about it, no argument, no fight, just a quiet knock on the door, a folded letter slipped under it, and the slow, mechanical sound of her world collapsing one final time. The landlord didn't even bother to speak to her directly. He'd already made it clear, one more late rent and she was out. And now here she was, standing on the cracked stairwell of a building that no longer wanted her, clutching two plastic bags of clothes, a backpack with her only jacket, and the notebook where she'd tucked the letter from him, a letter that once felt like hope but now just looked like a memory she couldn't afford. She tried sleeping in the diner's break room, but her manager caught her and threatened to fire her. She called every friend she still had, most didn't pick up, and those who did gave soft apologies and excuses she couldn't blame them for. So on the coldest week of the year, Lena found herself back at the train station, the very place where she had first seen him, this time not as a passerby, but as the one people stepped around without looking. She huddled against the wall near the vending machines, knees drawn to her chest, using a donated blanket from a church drive and a half-empty water bottle to make it through the night. The floor was hard, the fluorescent lights never went off, and no one asked her if she was okay. On the second night, she watched a couple walk past her with two young children in coats and gloves, laughing about hot chocolate and Christmas movies. She smiled faintly, then buried her face in her knees. The third night, a security guard told her she could only stay in the waiting area if she had a ticket. She didn't. She lied and said she was waiting for someone. He nodded with practiced indifference and walked on. She stayed up all night, listening to the announcements for trains she couldn't afford to board. She hadn't eaten since 2 nights ago, just a pack of crackers someone left behind on a bench. Her stomach ached. But her pride ached more. She didn't cry, not because she wasn't broken, but because she was too tired to be anything else. And then, on the fourth morning, just as the sun lit the far end of the platform in a soft golden glow, Lena sat slumped against the same bench where she had once stopped for a stranger and handed him her last $10. This time, she barely noticed the man who approached her. She assumed he'd keep walking like everyone else. She kept her head low, but he stopped, and then softly he said, "You don't remember me, do you?" She turned her head slowly, ready to apologize, ready to explain that she wasn't panhandling, she wasn't begging, she was just existing. But her words froze before they reached her mouth, because standing in front of her was someone she knew but didn't recognize. His coat was expensive, tailored. His shoes looked polished, his face clean-shaven, his dark hair combed back. He held a black umbrella in one hand and to take away coffees in the other. He looked like a Wall Street executive or a magazine cover, but his eyes, they were the same. "It's you," she said, her voice a whisper. From that night, he smiled softly and nodded. "You gave me your last $10, and you didn't even ask for my name." She blinked, not sure. "What was real? How did you find me?" "I came back to the station," he said. "Same day of the week, same time every week. I figured if you ever needed help, this would be the place you'd return to." He set the coffee down beside her. "I didn't want to miss my chance to repay you." Her throat closed. She wanted to laugh. She wanted to cry. She wanted to tell him how that $10 had nearly cost her everything, and yet somehow she didn't regret it. She looked down at the coffee, then back up at him. "Why?" she asked. "Why come back? You didn't owe me anything?" "You saw me when no one else did," he said simply. "And when I had nothing, your kindness reminded me of who I used to be." He reached into his coat and pulled out a business card, placing it in her hand. The paper was thick. The name, embossed in silver. "Marcus Vale, founder, Valitech Foundation." "You're him?" she said, stunned. She'd heard the name, a tech startup that exploded overnight, charity campaigns, innovation grants, a reclusive founder no one knew much about. I wasn't that person when we met, he said. I was running from everything: burnout, betrayal, the pressure to be someone I wasn't. I walked out of my own life that week, and no one stopped me. No one cared until you. Lena's fingers trembled as she held the card. I don't know what to say. Then don't say anything right now, Marcus said. Just come with me, get warm, eat, rest, then we'll talk. She hesitated. Not because she didn't trust him, but because she wasn't sure how to accept something good anymore. But when he extended his hand, she took it. And just like that, she stood not as the forgotten girl on the station floor, but as someone finally being lifted up, not by luck, not by charity, but by a moment of kindness that had circled all the way back. Everything hadn't changed yet, but something had begun, something real. Lena sat across from him in the booth, hands still wrapped around the paper coffee cup like it was the only warm thing anchoring her to the moment, trying to absorb the impossible truth unraveling in front of her that the man she had once handed her last $10 to on a rainy night outside a train station wasn't just a drifter or a stranger in need, but Marcus Vail, the reclusive founder of Valitech, one of the fastest-growing tech foundations in the country, a name she'd seen in headlines but never connected to the man with tired eyes and trembling hands. She blinked at the business card again, her mind racing to reconcile the version of him she saw now, clean-shaven, sharply dressed, calm and composed, with the broken man she had once handed money to without question. Why didn't you tell me sooner? She asked quietly, her voice still uncertain, as if speaking too loudly might make it all disappear. Marcus leaned back slightly, his gaze soft but steady. Because back then, I didn't know who I was either, he said. That night I met you, I had just walked out of my own boardroom, fired half my team, lost my best friend to betrayal. I'd spent years building something that didn't feel like mine anymore. I needed to be invisible, and you treated me like a human being when I couldn't even look in the mirror. Lena looked down, swallowing the knot rising in her throat. It was only $10, she whispered. Marcus shook his head. No, Lena, it was the only kindness I'd felt in months. That $10 didn't just get me home. It reminded me that good people still exist. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small folder, sliding it across the table to her. What's this? She asked. A job offer, he replied. She opened it slowly, eyes widening as she read the top line: Executive Assistant to Marcus Vail, temporary to permanent contract. There was a salary listed more than she'd ever imagined: earning, benefits, housing, a transportation stipend. I don't understand, she breathed. You don't even know me, he smiled. I know enough. I know you didn't hesitate to give when you had almost nothing. I know you've survived more than most people could even imagine. I know you're observant, empathetic, sharp. You could have looked past me, everyone else did. But you didn't. That tells me more than a ever could. She stared at the offer, disbelief flooding every inch of her body. I don't have experience. I've worked at a diner for the last 4 years. Then let's start with a week, he said. Shadow me, learn, ask questions. If it's not a good fit, you walk away, no strings attached. But if it is, then we build something together, not just a job, a future. Lena felt like the walls of the had faded, like the noise around them had gone silent, and all that remained was this surreal moment where the world cracked open and let light pour in. She wanted to ask if this was pity, a PR stunt, some carefully crafted narrative about redemption. But when she looked at Marcus, she didn't see a businessman trying to clean up a story. She saw a man who had once sat where she had, felt what she felt, and meant every word. I don't want charity, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Then don't take it, he said, leaning forward. Take the opportunity. You earned it. She wiped at her eyes, the tears coming faster now, not from sorrow, but from something unfamiliar, the sensation of being seen, not as a problem to be solved, but a person with value. I'll try, she said. That's all I ask, he replied. And with that, everything began to shift. He gave her a place to stay, a quiet guest apartment above the Valitech Community Center where his outreach programs were headquartered. It wasn't luxurious, but it was warm and safe, and hers. For the first time in a long time, she met his team, shadowed his meetings, took notes even when her hands were shaking from nerves. She learned how to draft emails, manage schedules, juggle Zoom calls and logistics and tech talk that sometimes flew over her head. She asked questions, lots of them, and Marcus never made her feel small for not knowing the answers. In fact, he praised her curiosity, her attention to detail, the way she noticed the things others missed. A month passed, then another. Slowly, Lena began to change not just her circumstances, but her posture, her presence, her confidence. She started walking with her head held higher. She began offering input in meetings. She caught inconsistencies in vendor reports. She even recommended a local shelter program Marcus later partnered with for a city-wide winter drive. But perhaps the most transformative change wasn't in her resume, it was in her belief that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't destined to be forgotten. One evening, as they stood outside the center watching volunteers pack food boxes, Marcus turned to her and said, "You were never invisible, Lena. You just needed the right place to shine." And in that moment, she believed him, not because of the job or the salary or the apartment, but because she had proved to herself that one small act of kindness could echo further than she'd ever imagined. And now, she was ready to do the same for someone else. 1 year later, Lena walked past the same bench, this time not broken, not hungry, not invisible, but whole, and in that quiet moment, as winter wrapped the station in a soft gray haze, she saw not just a place, but a memory that had shaped the course of 2 lives. The metal slats of the bench were still cold, the paint still chipped, the vending machines still humming nearby, but she wasn't the girl who once sat here clutching her last bag of clothes, too proud to cry and too exhausted to hope. She was different now, stronger, grounded. She wore a clean coat, simple, navy blue, her boots dry and warm, her hands steady, her head high. Behind her, the entrance to the Valitech Outreach Center glowed with soft lights, just across the street from the station, where her office now sat tucked behind glass doors with her name engraved in small letters, Lena Morin, Program Director. It still didn't feel real some days, that she had gone from scraping change for bus fare to organizing city-wide food drives, from dodging eviction to approving housing grants for people just like she had been. She hadn't taken the job to be in charge. She took it to make sure no one felt what she had once felt, abandoned, unseen, forgotten in plain sight. She'd met mothers with children who hadn't eaten in days, teenagers kicked out for being who they were, veterans with nowhere to go and nothing left to believe in. And every time she handed them a hot meal, a bus pass, a safe place to sleep, she remembered that moment, the rain, the $10 bill, the man on the bench who looked like he'd lost everything. Marcus stood beside her now, dressed casually, in a dark coat and scarf, holding 2 cups of coffee, the same brand he'd offered her a year ago. "Looks different now, doesn't it?" he said, offering her one. She smiled and took it, fingers brushing his like they had that day, though then he had been the one lost and she the one offering light. "It's still the same bench," she replied softly, "but I see it differently now." They sat side by side, letting the wind pass between them. No words for a moment, just breath and memory. Finally, Marcus broke the silence. "You gave me $10, he said, "but you gave me more than that. You reminded me of who I wanted to be." She looked at him, eyes glinting with quiet warmth. "And you reminded me that being seen can save someone's life." He nodded, humbled all over again. It was never about the money, never about grand gestures. It was about the simple human need to matter, to be acknowledged in a world moving too fast to notice. Lena sipped her coffee and looked around. The station hadn't changed much, but her presence in it had. She wasn't a ghost anymore. She wasn't an afterthought. She had stories to tell, lives to impact, and it all started with a choice she made when she had almost nothing left. Kindness, she had learned, was the only currency that never lost its value. She thought about mailing another letter, this time with no return address, just a handwritten note for someone else to find. Maybe tucked inside a coat pocket at a shelter, or slipped under a door where she knew someone was struggling. Just one sentence. Kindness never goes unseen, because if it reached even one person, if it gave them even a spark of hope the way his letter had done for her, then the cycle would continue and maybe, just maybe, the world would soften its edges a little. She turned to Marcus. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I hadn't stopped?" "Every day," he said, "and it reminds me to stop for others now." They sat there until the light dimmed, watching strangers rush by, none of them knowing that on that very bench sat two people who had once needed each other without realizing it. And now, having found their way back to themselves, they sat quietly, not as rescuer and rescued, not as millionaire and assistant, but as equals, as friends, as proof that in a world full of noise, sometimes the softest act echoes the loudest. Everything had changed, and it all began with a $10 bill, a cold night, and the decision to see someone when no one else did.